The 1930s, the Soviet Union. After investigation reveals that some members of the former Bolshevik Party question Stalin's authority, and that there is a network of party members supposedly working against him, Stalin believes anyone with ties to the Bolsheviks or Lenin's government is a threat to his leadership and needs to go. He initiates the Great Purge, which starts with the arrests of party members, Bolsheviks, and members of the Red Army, and then grows to include Soviet peasants, members of the intelligentsia, and members of certain nationalities. By 1938, hundreds of thousands of people are executed, and the oppression becomes so extensive that it is damaging the infrastructure, economy, and even the armed forces of the Soviet state. One of the highest-ranking Soviet officers to become a victim of the Great Purge is a man who initially supervised it. His name is Genrikh Yagoda. Genrikh Yagoda was born on the 7th of November 1891 in Rybinsk, then part of the Russian Empire. He was raised in a large Jewish family with 7 siblings, and his father was a jeweler by profession. Skilled in craftsmanship, his father was involved in underground activities, forging passports and other documents for Russian revolutionaries, and this environment had a profound impact on young Genrikh Yagoda. The family relocated to Nizhny Novgorod, and in 1907, at just 15 years old, Yagoda joined the Nizhny Novgorod anarcho-communists. This group believed in a stateless, classless society, where the means of production were communally owned and decisions were made collectively through direct action and mutual aid. By 1911, Yagoda was given the task of establishing contact with a Moscow group of anarchists to plan a joint bank robbery. However, upon his arrival in Moscow, Yagoda was arrested for carrying a forged passport. Since, as a Jew, he was not legally allowed to reside in Moscow, he was sentenced to 2 years of exile in Simbirsk. In Tsarist Russia, even in the early 20th century, Jews faced widespread discrimination and were subject to harsh restrictions under the empire's oppressive policies. They were largely confined to the Pale of Settlement, a designated region in Western Russia where Jewish residency was permitted. Outside this area, Jews were not allowed to live in major cities like Moscow or Petrograd, today's St. Petersburg, without special permission. These restrictions were part of broader anti-Semitic laws that sought to limit Jewish influence and control their movements. The laws reflected the deep-rooted prejudice of the time, forcing many Jews to live as second-class citizens in their own country. In honor of the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty, Yagoda's exile was reduced to 1 year. In 1913, he moved to St. Petersburg, where he found work at the Putilov factory, one of the largest and most significant industrial enterprises in the Russian Empire. In 1914, Yagoda married Ida Averbach, who was 14 years his junior. It is believed that Yagoda married Ida not so much out of love, but out of a desire to improve his social status, as she came from the family of a prominent Bolshevik. The marriage produced 1 son, Genrikh, born in 1929. The First World War began on the 28th of July, 1914, and by 1915, Yagoda was drafted into the army. He rose to the rank of corporal in the 20th Rifle Regiment of the 5th Army Corps. In the fall of 1916, he was wounded and soon after demobilized, returning to Petrograd. In 1917, Yagoda participated in the October Revolution in Petrograd, and the following year, he began working in the Cheka, the first Soviet secret police organization tasked with combating counter-revolutionary activities and securing the Bolshevik government's control. In 1919, he was transferred to Moscow, and over the next several years, he rapidly rose through the ranks, becoming the head of the Secret Operational Directorate, or the OGPU, in July 1927. By this time, the OGPU had become the successor organization to the Cheka. In his new position, Yagoda was responsible for intelligence, counterintelligence, and overseeing operations against perceived enemies of the state. Due to the poor health of the OGPU chairman Vyacheslav Menjinsky, Yagoda effectively took over the leadership of the organization. In October 1927, he played a significant role in suppressing anti-Stalin demonstrations, which were led by a coalition of prominent Bolsheviks, including Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev, who were critical of Joseph Stalin's increasing consolidation of power and his policies. Yagoda had known Stalin since 1918, but he was never fully aligned with him. During the forced collectivization of the Soviet Union's rural population, Yagoda was rumored to have sympathized with Nikolai Bukharin and Alexei Rykov, who opposed Stalin from the right wing of the Communist Party. Bukharin believed that Yagoda was on their side, but as it became clear that the right was losing the power struggle, Yagoda ultimately shifted his allegiance to Stalin. Bukharin's widow, Anna Larina, later condemned Yagoda, accusing him of abandoning his principles for the sake of his career, describing him as a criminal and a miserable coward. Under Yagoda's leadership, the state administration of camps, or the Gulag, was established, and the network of Soviet forced labor camps expanded rapidly. In the early 1930s, he was responsible for the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, a grandiose project that was supposed to connect the White Sea to the Baltic Sea. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, completed in just 20 months from 1931 to 1933, was built almost entirely by forced labor from the Gulag system. Approximately 126,000 prisoners were deployed to the project, working in brutal conditions with minimal tools and resources. The human cost was staggering, with an estimated 12,000 to 25,000 laborers dying due to exhaustion, malnutrition, and harsh weather. Despite the massive effort and sacrifice, the canal was poorly constructed, shallow, and ultimately of limited strategic value. In recognition of his role in the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, Yagoda was awarded the Order of Lenin, and a monument featuring a giant bronze bust of him was erected at the canal's last lock. The construction of the Moscow-Volga Canal was also started under Yagoda's watch. Built between 1932 and 1937, the canal was another massive infrastructure project primarily constructed by forced labor from the Gulag system. Upon its completion, the canal connected Moscow to the Volga River, significantly enhancing the city's access to the Caspian Sea and beyond. Around 200,000 prisoners worked on the canal, enduring brutal conditions. The project took 5 years to complete, and thousands of laborers died due to exhaustion, malnutrition, and the harsh working conditions. In February 1933, Yagoda, along with the head of the Gulag prison camp system, Matvei Berman, formulated a plan to deport 1 million people each to Western Siberia and Kazakhstan. These deportees, labeled as socially harmful and declassed elements, were intended to settle in sparsely populated areas. However, the plan quickly encountered severe logistical issues. The Soviet government lacked the resources, infrastructure, and proper planning needed to support such a massive relocation effort. One of the most infamous outcomes of this plan was the Nasino tragedy. In the spring of 1933, approximately 6,000 deportees were sent to Nasino Island on the Ob River in western Siberia. Conditions on the island were horrific. The deportees had no shelter, no tools, and received only minimal food supplies, which quickly ran out. The Soviet authorities also failed to provide adequate security or management, leading to chaos. As starvation set in, the situation deteriorated rapidly, with desperation driving some deportees to cannibalism, consuming the bodies of those who had died or been murdered. Within a few weeks, thousands had died from starvation, exposure, violence, and disease. Despite this tragedy, Yagoda continued to climb the ranks of the Soviet security apparatus, facing no immediate consequences for the failure of the deportation plan. In July 1934, just 2 months after Mezhinsky's death, Yagoda was appointed as the head of the OGPU, which he soon merged into the NKVD. After rising to the top of the Soviet Union's secret police, Yagoda became increasingly detached from reality, growing more arrogant and brutal in his methods. To fund the NKVD's foreign operations, he allegedly orchestrated a large-scale counterfeiting scheme, producing fake US dollar bills. This operation was intended to undermine the US economy and finance covert activities during Stalin's regime, although the actual implementation of this plan was never confirmed. In December 1934, following the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a close confidant of Stalin, Yagoda took charge of the investigation. He was also responsible for the arrest and prosecution of high-ranking officials like Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, members of the opposition bloc, who were accused of conspiring against Stalin and plotting to overthrow the Soviet government. Yagoda played a key role in organizing the first Moscow show trial, which led the prosecution and subsequent execution of Zinoviev and Kamenev in August 1936, marking the beginning of the Great Purge. In total, more than 250,000 people were arrested during the 1934 to 1935 period, including numerous party members, military officers, intellectuals, and perceived enemies of the state, as the Gulag system expanded rapidly under Yagoda's direction. Stalin, however, grew increasingly disillusioned with Yagoda's performance. In mid-1936, Stalin received a report from Yagoda detailing the unfavorable public reaction abroad to the show trials and the growing sympathy among the Soviet population for the executed defendants. This report enraged Stalin, who interpreted it as Yagoda's advice to halt the show trials, particularly the planned purge of Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the Marshal of the Soviet Union and former Commander-in-Chief of the Red Army. Another reason Stalin distrusted Yagoda was his failure to report the existence of the opposition bloc earlier. In August 1936, Mikhail Pavlovich Tomsky, a high-ranking official and member of the opposition bloc, committed suicide. In the postscript of his suicide note to Stalin, Tomsky wrote, "If you want to know who the people were that pushed me towards the right-wing opposition in May 1928, ask my wife personally. Only then will she name them." During this period, Yagoda had completely lost Stalin's trust, and Stalin had already found a new favorite for the dirty work, Nikolai Yezhov. Stalin sent Yezhov to meet with Tomsky's wife, and it was during this meeting that Yezhov discovered Tomsky had implicated Yagoda as one of the individuals who influenced his involvement with the right-wing opposition. In September 1936, Yagoda was replaced by Yezhov as head of the NKVD and demoted to the post of People's Commissar for Post and Telegraph. By January 1937, Yagoda was removed from this position as well and expelled from the Communist Party. In March 1937, Yagoda was arrested on Stalin's orders. Yezhov publicly announced Yagoda's arrest, accusing him of diamond smuggling, corruption, and acting as a German agent since he joined the party in 1917. Yezhov even claimed that Yagoda had attempted to assassinate him by spreading mercury around his office. Additionally, Yagoda was accused of poisoning the famous writer Maxim Gorky and his son. When authorities searched Yagoda's 2 Moscow apartments and his dacha, they made shocking discoveries. Among the items found were hundreds of bottles of various wines, antique dishes, foreign perfumes, and a large collection of women's clothing. The search also uncovered a staggering 3,904 pornographic photos, 11 pornographic films, 165 intricately carved pipes and cigarette holders with pornographic imagery, and a rubber dildo. Moreover, the bullets that killed Zinoviev and Kamenev were found, along with hundreds of books labeled as counter-revolutionary, Trotskyist, or fascist. In March 1938, Genrikh Yagoda was put on trial at the Trial of the 21, which consisted of 21 defendants alleged to belong to the so-called Bloc of Rightists and Trotskyists. Although he denied being a spy, he confessed to most of the other charges. During the trial, Yagoda was desperate for clemency, pleading directly to Stalin for mercy. He begged Stalin, saying, "I appeal to you. For you, I built 2 great canals." However, despite his appeals, Yagoda's fate was sealed. Genrikh Yagoda was 46 years old when he was executed on the 15th of March, 1938. Before his death, he was forced to watch the execution of others sentenced to death alongside fellow defendant Nikolai Bukharin. Yagoda endured additional torment when he was brutally beaten on the orders of Nikolai Yezhov before facing the firing squad. His downfall had dire consequences for his family as well. His father, aged 78 in 1938, disowned him in a desperate attempt to avoid the same fate, but eventually, along with his wife, he was arrested and later died in labor camps. Yagoda's sister, wife, and other members of the family were also executed. Yagoda's son Genrikh was kept in orphanages and later adopted his mother's surname Averbach, which saved him from possible death. Later in his life, Genrikh emigrated to Israel, where he died in 2003. In 1988, the Soviet authorities admitted that the trial of the 21 had been based on false confessions, and posthumously cleared the names of the other 20 defendants. However, Yagoda was notably the only one who was not rehabilitated, his legacy forever tainted by the brutal methods he once employed and the tragic downfall he ultimately faced. There were no tears shed for Genrikh Yagoda.
Thanks for watching the World History channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.